salvation out of this thing.
All right, guys. So back in our study in Romans, this is actually where we left off last week, midway through chapter 11. And so Paul had just gone through, chapter 9, where he said the Israel seeking righteousness, they actually missed out. And why was that? Because they did not pursue the righteousness by faith. Chapter 10, he went through all the reasons. Did they not hear the message? Did they not believe the message? Did not understand the message? And then in Romans chapter 11, he begins by saying God did not abandon his people, right? He said he uses himself as the evidence of that. And he says how God is always faithful. We ended up here at this slide. Paul goes back to his ministry to the Gentiles, which was actually in Galatians chapter 2 when he went to visit with James, Peter, and John, and he had that meeting with them. They came to the agreement that Paul, not Peter, Paul would go to the Gentiles, and the ministry of James, Peter, and John would be to the Jews. And he keys in off of that passage in Deuteronomy. That was actually in just the previous slide. He keys in off of the passage in Deuteronomy where God speaks of making Israel jealous with those who are no people and to provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. And he was using that passage to refer to the Gentiles. And just if you just think about it, right? If you just think about what Hasatan has done and I believe this is in the next slide when he talks about not being proud of yourselves. Yeah, he says in verse 18 there, do not be arrogant toward the branches that were broken off, as we get into this analogy of the olive tree. If you think about, just today, how Christians perceive Jews and how Jews perceive Christians, you see this division, this I don't know if I'd call it animosity, but there's obviously this division. And if you think about it, they both sides have like one piece of the puzzle. You have this wedge between the Christian church and the Torah, and then this with those who had received Yeshua as the Messiah, separated from those who have the oracles of God, when really they should come together. When we get through chapter 11 into chapter 12 and then into 14, 15, we're going to see how unity is a big thing. He's gonna really dig into the unity of the body, because one of the things that's an abomination to God is division, the division of his people. So actually, before we pick back up, if someone could actually read Romans chapter 11, verse 17 to the end to 36, and then that way we can finish out Romans chapter 11.
I can do that.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
17 through the end.
17 okay. To the end, yeah.
Okay. But if some of branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you are cut off, we cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of the mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Sion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards to the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards of election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of Jehovah, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen.
Thanks, Rob. And so Paul, in this beginning verses that we're going to start looking at here, he switches to this analogy of an olive tree to represent this nation of Israel, this kingdom of God, and then how the Gentiles participate in that. He says that some of the natural branches were broken off. And the key there is some of them, not all of them. And that ties back to the beginning of chapter 11 when he says, look, God has not abandoned his people. He's not forgotten his promises to Israel. And we looked at that last week, right, when we looked at dispensationalism and supersessionism, that Israel has not been replaced. The plan that God has for Israel has always remained the same, and they will remain a nation before him forever. So how is it that Gentiles take part in the covenants of God? Well, he says they graft into this olive tree, they graft into this kingdom. And so they're described as this wild olive branch that's grafted into a natural olive tree. And I find that curious. And I wonder if Paul came up with this analogy through the passage in Nehemiah 8. And that's when the exiles had returned from Babylonian captivity, and they're once again reading the Torah and rediscovering the commandments. And so Ezra, the scribe, he opens the Torah and he starts reading to them. They get to Sukkot, the feast of Sukkot, and they find, hey, we should build this sukkah, this booth. And it says to go grab all these various branches. And notice in the list of branches to gather, he has natural olive branches and wild olive branches. And I just found that fascinating, all the way back from Nehemiah. When they were building the sukkah, coming out of the exile, coming back into the land, they would build this booth with both natural olive branches and wild olive branches. And then they're rejoiced, right? Because they're once again keeping the feast, keeping the commandment of Sukkot. And that's a beautiful picture of what Paul was just saying here, right? This in Romans 11, how the wild olive branches, they graft into the natural olive tree. And I take that as also a beautiful picture of the unity too, right? Because you see them both grafting into the same olive tree. You see them both on the same sukkah. So the trespass resulting in salvation of the Gentiles. And so, this is what Paul had been mentioning in Romans 9, Romans 10, that there was this rejection. Even though Paul's ministry was to the Gentiles, you always see his heart for his brethren. And you see that in Romans chapter 9, 10 and 11, when he says, look, my heart's desire is that they would be saved, the brethren would be saved. And he even says, look, if I could give them my salvation, if I could be cursed that they could be saved, he would do it. That's that tremendous heart of the intercessor that Paul has. You see in Acts 18 when he's trying to testify to the Jews that Yeshua is the Messiah, but then they oppose him, they revile him, and so he says, look, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And then the Lord says, look, I have many people. The Lord is always faithful to preserve a remnant. So this plan for the Gentiles grafting in has always been the case. It's always been that Gentiles could graft in to join the nation of Israel. We see that throughout Scripture with Caleb, Rahab, Ruth, and into the New Testament period. And then we saw that with the Samaritans when we looked at 2 Kings, when we looked at the foreign nations that were brought into the land, and then they received the word and they made covenant with God. It's always been this grafting into Israel. When it came to John chapter 4, we see how the Samaritans so identify with the house of Israel, they even called Jacob their forefather. Then we come to this idea of the kindness and the severity of God. And then he says, well, Paul calls it kindness and severity. Moses calls it life and death, blessings and curses. And we see that throughout Torah, right? We see where, for example, when the spies went out into the land and then they came back, brought a bad report, uh, and God says, hey, go up and take the land, but they're afraid. And that lack of faith, that the severity there is, then they weren't allowed to go into the land, and if that entire generation had to die out. We saw that also with Esau and Jacob, between those who love God, those who hate God, with the love and the hate being referenced as loyalty and disloyalty. Moshe talks about this in Deuteronomy. He says, know therefore that Lord your God is faithful, who keeps covenant, steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. That's that faithfulness to 1,000 generations. Repays to their face those who hate him. So that's the disloyalty, unfaithfulness by destroying them. He will not be slack with those who hate him. He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do his commandment and the statutes and the rules that I command you today. And so what was the reason? Why did these natural branches get broken off? That's important to understand, right? And he tells us in verse 20, they were broken off because of unbelief, because of this lack of faith. And specifically, when we look back to Romans 9:10, we know that it was a rejection of the Messiah, the rock of offense. And that led to Romans 10 when he says, look, Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. And then that's when they started falling into idolatry. This, when they kind of were in this prosperous state. We actually see that, right? With Solomon, when in his prosperity, with all his many wives, they turn his heart away from the ways of the Lord. And he pretty much breaks every single commandment that God gives for a king of Israel. And we saw this prophesied in Isaiah. This is one that Paul had referenced before. And so Isaiah had prophesied of this stone of offense, this rock of stumbling, to both houses of Israel, and then many would stumble on it. And Paul had made this case that as a nation, they were in need of justification, which comes through faith. And that case is what he had built up through Romans chapter 2, 3, and 4. So then, okay, he talks about why they were broken off. But then a key question is, well, if you get grafted in, how do you stay grafted in, right? That becomes a key question. He says, oh, yes. He says, how much more the natural branches can be grafted back in? God has the power to graft them back in. We know that will come to pass, right? Zechariah 12 talks about how they would mourn the ones whom they have pierced. And then Ezekiel 37, we looked at that last week, how that the unifying force, and even the new covenant, right? That you don't need to tell your brother, everyone will know him. And so we come to this analogy, that this parable that Yeshua talks about himself as the vine and the Father as the vine dresser. And he says that he every branch that does not bear fruit, he takes away, cuts off. He says a branch cannot bear fruit unless it abides in the vine. And so the two things about staying grafted in that Yeshua mentions in John 15 is
You freeze?
their fruit so that you're not cut off. Then how do you know you're abiding? Well, in 1 John 3:23, he says, this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his son, Yeshua HaMashiach. And so the question is, whose commandment? He says his commandment. That's the Father's commandment. because he's talking about his son. So this is the commandment from the Father, that we believe in the name of his son, Yeshua HaMashiach, and that we love one another. And so this is where you could, when you recollect back to Torah, where Moshe talks about, hey, God would raise up a prophet likened unto me, a prophet like me from among your brothers. It's to him you must listen, just as he commanded us. Whoever keeps his commandments abides in God and God in him. And we know, and by this we know that he abides in us by the Spirit whom he has given us. And so in this abiding in this vine, right? Abiding in Yeshua, abiding in God, there's a few different aspects. There's the aspect of faith, right, which leads to this born again spirit. And there's this aspect of keeping his commandments, obedience. And of course, that leads to this bearing fruit, the changed nature, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so forth. And then he talks about this partial hardening and this interesting phrase that he uses, the fullness of the Gentiles, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. This hardening, right? Because he begins off by saying, look, God hasn't abandoned Israel, and that his promises will be fulfilled. And he talks about how there was this hardening, how some were hardened, some were saved, the elect were saved, and the rest were hardened. And he's saying, look, this hardening is only until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. And so the question is, well, when is that time complete? When is this partial hardening over for Israel? And so this fullness of the Gentiles, he says it's at that time all Israel will be saved. And so that's the time. That's when the hardening is complete. And he gives us a couple of passages to key
Hey, Matt.
on the timing. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
So in the translation, the Greek, they uses the word porosis, and they use two different translations there. They use blindness, it's used twice as much, and then hardness only once. So the question
Oh,
is there a
interesting.
difference between blinding and hardening?
Interesting. So that's a great question. So I didn't look that up, so I wasn't aware. And so you're saying, Rob, that it's more commonly translated blinding. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah,
Interesting. So it's like they cannot see him as the Messiah.
yeah.
They just can't see. They just can't see it. Wow, that's interesting.
Which is the
Oh, I
same
was
thing
gonna.
happens in the churches. Same thing. They just can't see the law or the Torah as being. They just blind. They're blind to it, and
Yes.
and,
You
and
know what?
blindness usually comes from bad teachers.
Yeah. So that's an excellent point. When I was in the Baptist church, and I was there for a very long time, I remember many occasions when we come across a difficult passage for our doctrinal theological position, such as Romans 3:31. We would just ignore it. We would
Hmm?
continue on. We would never mention it again. And that goes back to the blindness that you're talking about, Rob. So that is very interesting. Uh,
It's like that the apostles on the way to Emmaus, when Christ appeared to them, they were blind, right?
Yeah,
yeah, that's true. Oh, yeah, you're right, Paul. That's exactly that.
and,
Yeah, that's right. So that
and
speaks to the
Saul and Saul
blindness.
and Saul was blinded by the lightning bolt, and he was
Yeah,
blinded.
Mhm.
So you see this form of blindness being used over and over and over. What happened
yeah,
in Sodom and Gomorrah? They were when they try to get in the house, they were blinded.
And yeah,
So
right,
this is
right.
kind of a tool. It seems like a tool that God uses when there's unbelief.
But does it
Yeah,
is this a function of affecting man's will or ability, or and I'm this has always been a struggle for me, this verse, because it appears that God, how does this interfere with the way in which God has made us in His image of
hmm
having libertarian free will, and of course the Calvinists say, oh, there you go with your you're worshiping your free will again, but
Yeah.
You know, this is, I think hardening is harder for me to accept than blinding, because I guess I go back to what I've been learning the last year or so. This is the realm that we live in, the realm of that God has had to hide himself from us so that we can actually have a free will. Otherwise, if there's only one choice, if we could actually see God for who he really is, his glory would fill the night sky. It would never be, it would outshine the sun. So he's had to, in a sense, hide himself so that we actually have the ability to make decisions independent of him, I guess. Like it said, he created the darkness. You know, if he exists in unapproachable light. So I'm wondering if this blinding is really just part of just like he put Moshe in the cleft in the rock so he couldn't see his face and wouldn't die. Do you think that's the case? Because to me, it's a challenge to free will.
So Tyler, so in I'll give you an example. In Isaiah 44, it talks about how idolatry. It doesn't say the word blind. It does, but it speaks of blindness because of idolatry. So, so I'll give you an example. If everybody here knew that yoga is directly connected to Shiva, one of the gods of India, and you knew that that's something that was taught with those who follow and worship Shiva, you would never do yoga. But I have seen around the country where even churches have these yoga days and times of yoga, and people get involved in yoga. So they think, oh, it's just breathing and all that stuff. Okay, and that's fine if that was the plain truth. But the plain truth is it's something connected directly to idolatry. And so what happens is you don't all of a sudden worship a stone or a rock or a piece of wood overnight. You start by doing things that seem innocent, but eventually it ends up blinding you. And so that's how your free will is being affected, because either curiosity does it or something's introduced to you to create a test to loyalty. And God says he's going to test us all the time. So if a testing is put in place for everybody, then that means we can be blinded if we fail those tests. That means we fall in these traps. So it's not a case of just free will, because we still have free will to choose not to worship a stone or a piece of wood. But when we get tricked by the world or family or friends into doing something, it's a slippery slope. And next thing you know, you're caught and blinded, and then it's hard to get back.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think
free will is always exercised throughout the process.
Yes, the whole way. You always say, whoa, what am I doing looking at this rock here and calling it a god, and or this monkey or whatever. You can still say this is idiotic, but you didn't start worshiping a monkey or whatever because a monkey was sitting in front of you. You started it because it was connected to something else that drew you in.
It's like, how did this basket filled with colored eggs find its way into my hand?
Bingo. Today's
that's a good one. Yeah, that's a good one. And I would just go back to the case of Pharaoh, right? Because Paul midrashes that in Romans chapter 9, and what we looked at there is that it was Pharaoh's choice multiple times before God started hardening his heart in the decision that he had already made. As far as the blindness that we have, and just speaking for my own experience, it was out of ignorance, because it's just what had always been taught to me. And so it took a little bit of time for the Lord to open my eyes to that. I had seen it before, but it was always ignored and passed over. It was not only until just a few years ago when I came to the realization, coming across some teachers, that actually we have it wrong. We have it very wrong in the Baptist church.
Well, and another thing a lot of us get into is television and watching things that are listening to obscenities. And now we just take it for granted, First it bothered us. And
that's all part of that initial stuff. That it's like the yoga example, Mom. Yoga's innocent in its sense of stretching and breathing, right? but it's
Right,
connected to something. And the same thing, when you watch some violent film, it's still connected to somebody because the writer's probably got demonic influence on them.
right.
So,
They definitely got a agenda.
yeah.
We're talking about for our kids way back and things that they watched. We didn't even recognize what they were looking at.
Yeah, so as far as the curious case of when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, this hardening, this blindness that Israel has is only going to stick. Now, obviously, this is not all Israel because he talks about the remnant and he talks about himself. Where obviously, Paul recognized Yeshua as the Messiah eventually, right? Not always, but eventually. Now, this blindness, he says, is only until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. And he tells us the timing of when that blindness comes off. It's when this deliverer comes from Zion to banish ungodliness, and when he comes to take away their sins. And so Isaiah, let's see, from the river Euphrates. So that's speaking of the boundaries of the promised land that is spoken of Ezekiel 47. And so I take the fullness of the Gentiles coming in to be the end of the tribulation period, the time when the Redeemer comes to Zion, when he splits the hill. And also, that's also the time that leads into this Feast of Sukkot, when the Lord returns. And it just so happens that at the Feast of Sukkot, there's 70 bulls that are sacrificed that kind of represent the nations. And so I just thought that was all very interesting in the symbolism in the feast, where you have this joyous feast, 70 bulls sacrificed for the nations, representing, I guess, the Gentiles. Okay, so he says, regards to the gospel, they're enemies for your sake, referring to the Jews, right? Those who are hardened. And so how are they enemies of the gospel and their persecution of the saints, the persecution that Saul himself did? But it says that they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. And so we know that he's always faithful to his covenants. Let's see. He starts to go into a lot of references of Old Testament passages. Let's see, what does it say? Gifts and calling. So in Psalm 89, let's see, the one who is mighty I've chosen, exalted from a people. So I've forgotten the reference here, what Psalm 89 was about. Do you know, Rob? I don't remember why I put this there. But I guess this is I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found David my servant with my holy oil. As far as the gifts and the calling of God being irrevocable, Psalm 105 speaks about his covenant through Abraham, continued through Isaac, and then confirmed with Jacob, this everlasting covenant. And part of that is the promised land.
So if you go to Deuteronomy 33 or Genesis 48 and 49, if you go to those references, those are blessings that are irrevocable for the sons of Jacob. Okay. So as
Yeah,
example,
that's right.
Joseph, his the richness of the everlasting hills and things of that nature. So material wealth and things like that are not irrevocable. Now there is punishment that goes, but there'll be rises and falls. But
Yeah.
that all of Israel would be given gifts that were irrevocable, all 12 sons. Okay. And so even in the diaspora, even as they migrated out or they were cast out, they would still receive blessings. That's why the house of Israel was not erased, because of that promise. If the house of Israel had been erased, then God would be a liar back in Genesis
Right.
49.
Yep. Yep. That's right. That's right. Thank you, Rob. And so he says, you were also at one time disobedient. So this just ties back to, hey, don't be proud that these branches were broken off to make room for you, the wild olive tree. And he reminds them, you were also disobedient at one time. And then he talks about the disobedience of Judah, so that God may have mercy on all. And that ties back into the case that Paul made in Romans chapter 2 and 3, that everyone is in need of his justification. How were they disobedient? Well, that he had just listed out in the rejection of the Messiah, which he says, well, not he, John says in 1 John 3, that there's a command that the Father gives to believe in his Son. They also failed on the weightier matters of the Torah. They did things for their recognition, their own honor, and that's the woes in Matthew 23 that Yeshua points out. And then he ends with this this praise of the Lord, right? He, God's amazing wisdom working out all things for his people. He knows that eventually all Israel will be saved. And so these are all quotes from various Tanakh passages. Who has the mind of the Lord? Who has been his counselor? So that's verse 34. And that's a quote from Isaiah 40. Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man has shown him counsel? Obviously, no one, right? His thoughts and his ways are far above ours. Verse 35, who has given him a gift that he might be repaid? And well, in Job, that's a quote from Job. God owns everything.
I got a question
He
about
owns
that, Matt.
everything. Yeah, go ahead.
So he asked a question. He doesn't make a statement. That's what I love about the scripture. God always asks questions. Okay, so we have to answer that question. It says, "Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him his counsel?" So man, I guess the way it's written there, that man shows him his counsel, but man does receive counsel from him because they've been in his counsel. And a perfect example is Isaiah 6, right? Where Isaiah is taken into the counsel of the Lord, and there's other seers who've been brought in the counsel. So what does he actually mean by who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him his counsel? It's because obviously God has brought us into his counsel occasionally, or he has brought Moses into his counsel.
Yeah, so the way I take verse 34, he's asking who has known God's mind and who has counseled God, and the answer is no one, because he's praising the depths of the riches and wisdom of God, that God knows all of these things and his amazing plan for the salvation of all of Israel, and how he's amazed at God's wisdom and working out all these things from Israel's rejection and fall, that he had already planned out how they would be brought back in. And so what he's saying is no one, because he's so far above our abilities, right? That he's so far above us. And then who has given him anything that he has to repay us anything? And
Right.
Job tells us no one. No one has given him anything that God owes us anything. God doesn't owe us anything because God owns everything. And then verse 36. And for from him and through him are all things. That's that famous song, right? We actually sung that today at service. It's such a beautiful song. And that's actually Paul's quote himself. He had mentioned this in a couple of other passages, but it's really interesting because he talks about how all things are to and for both the Father and the Son in different passages. So in Colossians 1:15, he says, he is the image of the invisible God. That's the Son. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. By him, by Yeshua, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, with thrones and dominions. All things were created through him and for him. So through Yeshua and for Yeshua. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning of the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things were on earth and in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. But then in 1 Corinthians 8, he says, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist. And so for both, he lists them both. And this goes back to the Echad, the oneness of the Father and the Son, and one Lord, Yeshua Messiah, through whom all things and through whom we exist. And so in one passage, he says, look, it's for the Son, and in the other, it's for the Father. And it's for both. They are Echad. We're into Romans 12. If someone could read Romans 12, verses 1 to 13 for me, please.
Oh, all good. Romans 12:1. I urge you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And through the grace given me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, but to use sound judgment, as God has assigned to each person a measure of faith. For just as we have many parts in one body, and all the parts do not have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Messiah, and everyone parts of every one parts of one another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace that has given to us. If prophecy, in proportion in our faith, if service, in our serving, or the one who teaches in his teaching, or the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who gives in generosity, the one who leads with diligence, the one who shows mercy with cheerfulness. Let love be without hypocrisy, detesting what is evil, holding fast for the good. Be tenderly devoted to one another in brotherly love, but to one another in giving honor. Do not be lagging in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Keep serving the Lord, rejoicing in the hope, enduring in distress, persisting in prayer, contributing to the needs of the Kedoshim, extending hospitality.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And
Okay.
so Romans 12:1, that word worship, he says, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. This is your spiritual worship. That word worship is typically spoken of sacred services that the priests carry out. And an example of that is Hebrews 9, where it talks about these preparations having thus been made. The priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. That worship is they're performing their duties. Is the priesthood performing their service. And so when you think about that applied to us, right, that covenant that God made at Sinai, he says, you would be to me a royal priesthood, this priesthood, this holy nation. And so when we think about this presenting our bodies a living sacrifice, that's our priestly service to him. He says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. And he's kind of touched on this before. He's talked about how in Romans 6 that we use our bodies as instruments of righteousness, no longer as instruments of sin. He says, present yourselves, your whole selves to God as though you've been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments of righteousness. This spiritual worship, he's looked at he's tied, kind of gone over this a little bit in Romans 6, 7, and 8, where he talks about our repentance, this ongoing process of sanctification, where we are constantly making that decision to put to death the flesh and to choose the way of the Spirit. And if we look at how this is lived out in Paul's life, he's mentioned this many times, or in a number of his letters, in different ways, on how he's entire life is for the Messiah. His entire life is lived out for God, for God's purposes. In Galatians 2:20, it says, "I've been crucified with Messiah. No longer I who live, but Messiah who lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Philippians 3, I count everything as lost because of the surpassing worth of knowing the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, my Lord. For his sake, I suffer the loss of all things, count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ, be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but which comes from faith. And then Acts 20, right here, he's through the Holy Spirit, he's told how much he must suffer, right? He's talking about how he's going to be imprisoned and afflicted when he goes to Jerusalem. And he says, I do not account my life of any value, nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course in the ministry that I have received from the Lord Yeshua to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. Now behold, I know that none of you who have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will see my face again. And then finally, it just reminds me of Revelation 12, the saints in the tribulation period. It says they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of the testimony, and loved not their lives even unto death. So, Rob, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, so that word avodah is probably what was used in when he wrote this, which means their service in the temple. But you think about what the commitment that you had as a priest. I mean, you're up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Uh, you have to completely bathe in mikveh. You go through the lots around 5:30. Your first job is probably starting about 6:30 in the morning. You're barefoot on the Temple Mount. You never wear shoes. You have your certain garments. They got to be consecrated, always clean. You work all the way until the dark, twilight. When you finally get done, then you go down and you go sleep. And then in the morning, you start all over again, that same service.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the long hours and the commitments, whether it's winter, summer, it doesn't matter. It's snowing on the Temple Mount. It's scorching sun on the Temple Mount. You're still working. And you think about it. So I'm just talking about the actual hard, and you're doing it for 20 solid years. You don't stop 20 years. And then when you're done with it at 50, then you start training people and you're in the training field. You're the teachers to teach the next generation to start working the temple. So, and there's no such thing as retirement. It's never mentioned in the Bible. So literally from the time you were born into the priesthood to the time you die, your whole life is dedicated to that and nothing else. And so when you think about what he's saying here, is that's what's kind of an expectation for us in the ministry, a Messiah. We are it's sun up, sun down. It's every moment of our day. It's all the time. It's from the time you receive him into your heart to the day you give up your last breath. And and I don't think most people understand that what it's required, because that requirement is, we say that of a missionary or a pastor, but he's not talking about missionaries and pastors. He's talking about everyone.
Yeah, that's right. And what that reminds me of, I always go back to the Shema, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that word soul is your life. You love him with your nefesh, your whole life, your whole, and the way Paul puts it is your whole being. And so that's spot on, Rob. Paul also describes us. He says, present your bodies a living sacrifice. He describes our bodies as a temple of God. And if you just think that what God did in the temple, that's where his presence dwelt. And when you look at the various passages in the Brit, it talks about God's spirit dwelling within us. And so how does that work? Well, God gives us instructions for what we should do, what we should eat, what we should say, what we should think to create this pure and holy set apart place for him to dwell. And that was also the case with the temple, requiring purification to create a place that was suitable for his presence. If you look back in the Torah, when his presence came to fill the tabernacle, what was the circumstances or what were the actions carried out leading up to that? It says Moshe did everything Jehovah commanded. And so an aspect of the Lord's presence dwelling the tabernacle was obedience to everything that he had commanded. And so too, we could use that as the example for God's spirit dwelling in us. And Yeshua mentions this in John 14. And if anyone loves me, he keeps my word. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. This also reminds me of the Olah. When you look at the sacrifices, the whole burnt offering, where the entire offering is completely consumed. It's spoken of Jephthah's daughter. If you all recall, Jephthah was the judge. He went out and he came back and he's like, whoever comes out first, I'm going to give that as the burnt offering to the Lord. And his daughter comes out. And usually in the Christian world, they're taken, there's gas of shock, right? How could he burn up his daughter? But this is actually taken to mean that her life was dedicated to the service of the Lord. Because if you look at what they mourn, they don't mourn her life, they constantly mourn her virginity, because she would be wholly dedicated, a life dedicated to him. The burnt offering was something that was voluntary. It says it's a free will offering. And so when he talks about, and if I'm getting this right, when he's talking about presenting ourselves a living sacrifice, that's a voluntary presentation of ourselves, of giving over ourselves voluntarily to the Lord, as a burnt offering would have been. And in Leviticus 1, when it talks about this burnt offering, there's two aspects of this. It's when you would draw near. It's like when you would draw near, you would bring with you the thing to draw near, the sacrifice, the offering, the korban. Oh, and that's the Hebrew. That's right. So in the Hebrew, korban, which is what's translated as offering, coming from the root word karav, which means to draw near or to approach. So essentially, when you want to draw near to Yehovah, to the Lord, you would bring your korban, which is the thing to be brought near. In 2 Corinthians 2, also the reason why I think it's likened to the Olah is because, this, if you look at the Olah, when it's burnt, it produces this pleasing aroma to the Lord, Yehovah. In 2 Corinthians 2, it talks about us being this aroma, this pleasing aroma to God, and it's pleasing to those who are being saved, and it's a fragrance of death to those who are perishing. Now, he talks about, hey, present yourself a living sacrifice, right? And so when you ever think about living sacrifice, that's why I went to the sacrifices, right? Back to the instructions of the sacrifices. However, there are requirements, prerequisites before you bring your sacrifice. An example of that is when Saul is commanded to destroy everything of the Amalekites, but then he keeps the sheep and the oxen, and then so Samuel's like, hey, first Saul says, hey, I did everything the Lord commanded, and Samuel's, and why do I hear all this bleating of sheep in my ear and the lowing of oxen in my ear? And then Samuel tells him, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the voice of the Lord? He says obedience, he says to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is a sin of divination. And so there's an aspect of obedience that's required before you bring your offering. Or, if there is something to be settle with your brother, to do that first. And that's actually what Yeshua says too. So Saul says, I've sinned. Oh, that was the next the next passage I had, yes. And so before you bring your offering, you need to settle with your brother. As part of this requirement before bringing your sacrifice, and ultimately entering the presence of God is with clean hands and a pure heart. Then he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may test and discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. He's touched on this before. Paul has mentioned how the renewing of the mind is key to our life in the spirit. It says, those who set their mind on the flesh leads to death. The mind set on the spirit leads to life and peace. And he talks about being transformed in your mind so that you could test. Go ahead. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Rob.
don't gloss over that one. Because that renewing the mind is it's really interesting, because it's quoted a lot of times, but it's really not completely understood. So how does an alcoholic renew his mind? How does somebody who's steeped in their sin or witchcraft or whatever renew their mind? How does a teenager renew its mind and grow up as an adult and see things differently? And I kind of goes back to that blindness that we had in the beginning. That blindness keeps you from renewing your mind. But once you see him, and you confess your sins, then it's an immediately process that begins to renew your mind. And but not everybody who's a believer renews their mind. They're still stuck in their past. They're still stuck in the things that blind them, and the things that got them to fall in the first place. And so I wish Christianity in general would spend a lot of time on this, because this literally to me is how people get out of that transitional place in Christianity and
Yeah.
gets fully into the Torah.
Yeah. And what I would mention there is also that it's not an instant thing. There's
No.
a period of growth, right? I mean, and the scripture talks about this, and this is actually what I was going to get into. I think that's the next set of passages. Yes. So it talks about how yeah, there's this aspect of growth, right? Because that happens over time. He says, by now you should have been teachers, but you still need someone to teach you these basic principles. You're on milk. He's speaking of them as children, and this analogy of, when you're born again, you start as a baby, right? You have to grow. You still have to have this time to grow. And you do that through practicing the word. That's what he tells it. The writer of Hebrews says. It says that your power of discernment is trained by practice, constant practice, distinguishing good from evil, and that's through an understanding of the oracles of God. And how do you get that? Well, you have to study the word. You have to know the word first to be able to practice it, to be able to discern. And then, Paul tells us in Thessalonians to test everything, hold fast that what is good. This also goes back to what Paul was telling us in Romans 8, to set your mind on things of the Spirit. How are you supposed to know what the things of the Spirit are if you haven't read the word to know
Right.
to what to set them your mind on? And so it goes back to this, your actions show what you believe or how much you believe, I guess. If you care to give up your day to study the word, or you'd rather watch the sports or whatever, right? So Acts 17, the Bereans, they were of noble mind, because they did not accept the things that Paul said, that they listened to him, and then they went and examined the scriptures to see if those things were so. That's that testing aspect from First Thessalonians, test everything. And then to take every thought captive to Christ. There was another passage I must have left off. It's in Ephesians, where he talks about how, when you're growing up and you're going through this process of sanctification and maturity, you're still tossed to and fro by every wave of doctrine, because you're not firmly rooted and you're not settled. And so there's that aspect of, you have to go through and discover a lot of these things. And I think many of us have gone through that journey ourselves. I know I certainly have, switching from Buddhism to Catholicism to Jehovah Witness to Baptist church, and then as I look back on my life, started an atheist. There was always like a small step closer, right? Each time God was taking me a little step closer. And who knows, maybe I still have a ways to go. God's Torah is written on our hearts. And so when you think about him writing his Torah on our heart, there are certain things that he can write, because it talks about in Romans chapter 2 how the Gentiles who had the Torah written on their heart did things just naturally. But there's a lot of instructions as well that we need to put in within us. That's what Psalm 119 talks about, having his word on our heart, that we will not sin against him. Oh, I jumped ahead. Yeah, so that's the 2. Romans chapter 2, how it's demonstrated having the Torah written on our hearts. And it's an aspect of the born again spirit, right? That's what Paul tells us in Romans 7. Your born again spirit delights in the Torah of God. It's the flesh, he says in the very next chapter, the mind of the flesh is unable to submit to the Torah of God. It's not able. It's physically unable to submit to God's Torah. But if you're born again, you should delight in it. And then Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. So all your heart is labab. It refers to your inner man, your mind, your will, your heart. You should love the Lord your God with all your soul, your nefesh, your life. And you should love him with all your might. That's your mayod, your force, your strength, your might. So you love the Lord your God with your inner man, your mind, your will, your heart, your soul, your life, your force, your strength, your whole being. You love the Lord your God with your entire being. And then he goes into
Amen.
serving one another. Yeah, thanks, brother. And so this gets into the aspects of unity, and Paul's going to get into this quite a lot in the following chapters, because he had just pointed out, he's been going throughout the book of Romans about the Jews and the Gentiles, and then we just look at the state of Christianity and Judaism today, and they typically don't want anything to do with each other. But you look at this early church; it had both Jew and Gentile there. And he's gonna get into this aspect where they need to come together, and we know in future, like with Ezekiel 37, they'll be united as one kingdom once again, with one king over them. And so, how do we operate in the body? So he says we're all given different gifts, and these gifts are various abilities for service. And those gifts are given not for our own pride, but for the building up of the body. And so when he says, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, he's telling us not to lack humility. Don't be overly proud of yourself. And James says this, Peter also said this. He says, God opposes the proud, he gives grace to the humble. That word, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. That hyperpropinio is to be overly proud, to have high thoughts. So he's saying, don't be overly proud, or to have, overly high thoughts of yourself. Rather be of sound mind. And so that right judgment is also not having a false humility, such that you don't even exercise your gifts. So that Greek word is sophronio, to be of sound mind, to be temperate. And so we know that God is building up his church. And we know we cannot build the church without God or without the Spirit. 1 Peter 2 says that you yourselves, like living stones, are built up as a spiritual house to be that holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices. That's that priestly service. Matthew 16, Yeshua tells Peter that he's going to build his church. So how do we recognize these living stones that God is building up around us, right? Because he's talked about in this passage here, and he says we're all members of one body. We don't all have the same function. We don't all have the same gifts, but it's all for the service of the body, of building up his body. How do you recognize the brethren? How do you recognize these living stones that God is building up? And Yeshua says it very plainly. He says, by this, everyone will know, everybody, that you're my disciples, and that's by your love for one another. And then in John 3:10, actually, that's 1 John. I got that. I missed the 1 John there. It should be 1 John 3:10. By this, it's evident. It's clear. It's clear who the children of God are, who the children of the devil. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God. And so what is righteous, it goes back to earlier in that chapter where he says, sin is the breaking of the Torah, sin is lawlessness, nor is the one who does not love his brother. And so the child of God is distinguished or sanctified, or you can see who it is by two characteristics, righteousness and love. And 1 John 4 says, if anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, then he cannot love God whom he has not seen.
Matthew,
He-
I'm
he
also
talk-
reminded of, for some reason, I'm also reminded of that we're being built up into a spiritual house, into both Jew and Gentile,
Yeah.
into one new man.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That was what Peter wrote about, that we're living stones being built up. And you're absolutely right. It is Jew and Gentile that this house is being built up on the foundation of the cornerstone being Yeshua and the foundation of the prophets and the apostles, is what he says. So we're all members of the same body with different functions, but we're all important, we're all loved, we're all included, and we're all honored. And so he goes into this more in depth in 1 Corinthians 12. He mentions it here in Romans 12. And 1 Corinthians 12, he says the body does not consist of one member, but many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, let's see, where was it? If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, right? First Peter he just wrote about that, right? God is building up these living stones, building them up into a spiritual house. And Paul says, you all put together are the temple of God, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem weak are indispensable. And on those parts of the body we think less honorable, we bestow more honor, and our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body. God has built up the body. God has putting together these living stones, compose the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. That's that love that Yeshua talked about. How do you know they're my disciples? Because they love one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Now, if you are the body of Messiah and individually members of it, God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, gifts of healing, helping, administration, various kinds of tongues, all apostles, all teachers, and so forth. But then he says at the end, he says, I will show you still a more excellent way. And that leads into the famous 1 Corinthians 13. And we know that more excellent way is the excellent way of love, the way of love. And so the purpose of the spiritual gifts, he tells us clearly, it's to build up his body. It's not for your honor. It's not for your own benefit. Ephesians 4, he says very similar thing. I gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds to equip the saints, to equip the body for the work of ministry, for building up this temple of God, this body of Messiah, until we all attain to the unity of the faith, the knowledge of the Son, mature manhood, that process of growth to measure the stature of the fullness of Messiah. We talked about the body. Oh, and this talks about how it is, right? We should be unified in the body. Paul talks about unity quite a bit. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And this was Yeshua's prayer for us, right? In John 17, before he would be taken to be crucified. His prayer for us is that we would be ehad, that we would be one, just as he and the Father are ehad, in the same way. And he speaks of the body as his bride, right? In Ephesians 5, he says, Yeshua is the head of the church, the ecclesia, which is his body. And then he says, this is a mystery that I'm telling you. He says he's referring to Yeshua and his church, his ecclesia that he's building up. When Saul persecutes the saints and Yeshua comes to him, he says, why are you persecuting me? Saul is persecuting the saints, but Yeshua is speaking to Saul as if though he's getting persecuted directly. And that just speaks to how the body, we as his are his body, and he sees us as such. Yeah, go
Amen.
ahead, Rob.
So that as you're reading this, you're thinking we are probably the most divided that we've ever been in our history. Probably the most. I mean, maybe not.
Yes.
I don't know history, but completely. But we are
Yes.
so divided. Every denomination thinks the other one's going to hell. And
Yes.
and
Yes.
but so what brought the body together? The only thing that brings the body together is basically what happened to Paul. He began to terrorize the body. He began to persecute him. So only through persecution do we come together. So
Mm.
the more divisiveness we are, the more it invites the Lord basically bringing persecution on us, which means, I mean, nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. But you ask anybody in any church, do you want to be persecuted? They'll say no. Well, if you don't start
Yeah.
uniting with the rest of the body, then this is what's coming. And
Yeah.
and I
Yeah,
think
that's
that's
right.
eye opening
And
too.
it just serves to the interests of Hasatan, right? Because Hasatan wants these divisions. And a lot of it is also goes back to labels, I think. There's just one church, there's one body, not all these different bodies and groups. And I think another aspect of it is what Paul has been mentioning here is the humility, and to do as the Bereans did, to go back and search the word, and not just, you look at, okay, there's these disagreements, these divisions. I mean, even Rob and I, we haven't always agreed on everything, but what is it that we should do? We should, okay, I haven't seen that. Let me look at the scriptures and let's see what it
Yeah.
says. It should go back to God as the authority, not that we just stay separated and we just dislike each other, or we should seek that reconciliation, just as Yeshua sought reconciliation for us to the Father. And he says we are given that ministry of reconciliation for the world to the Father, but also that we are to be peacemakers. We're supposed to be blessed are the peacemakers. So it's one of the Beatitudes. But you're absolutely right. It is a sad state of division. There is so much division, even in just the Messianic groups. So much like
It's horrible. It's
bickering
horrible.
and division, just even in the small body of the Messianic Hebrew roots even. So I don't know, but when the Lord
You know,
returns, he
you know
will
what it always
unify us all.
for me, it's I can sit down and break bread with somebody who doesn't agree with me completely in theology. If he has a sense of kindness, there's a fruit of the spirit there. Even if his theology is jumbled up or it's not like mine, I don't have problems. In fact, I actually enjoy that because I know that it's not going to be this things of strife. But when
Mm,
there's no humility with that person and they're just it's my way the
yeah,
highway, or I don't want to hear your point of view, and
that's
or let
it.
me try to
Yeah.
convince you as soon as we sit down. That's what drives people. And so all I
Yeah.
get the message right from the beginning goes down to your humility. If you don't have humility,
Yes.
then there's no echad. They can't be.
Yes.
Yes.
That's right. That's right. And without humility, the pride produces a blindness as well. Like if you don't
Yes.
have humility, and like you were saying, Rob, my way or the highway, you are unable to learn from the things you haven't seen or the things you're blind to, or it's a stumbling block to growth. It's a roadblock to growth for own personal growth, to be able to grow and learn. Um, but
Amen. It really
yeah,
does. It really does start with us because, like, even last night, we said the bracha with my family and welcomed in the Sabbath and had challah and the boy the pre hagafen and my dad said, well, how many what do you have to get? What do you have to do to get you to complete your full Jewish card? And then another time he said, my son the rabbi. And he's just trying to be funny, but that became an opportunity for in humility and in kindness to instruct and to teach
Yeah.
and to say, to bring
yeah,
them in. It really does start with us, and it's every interaction that we have with people is the opportunity to share the good news you know, of what relationship with Yeshua, with Jesus
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
That
And
must
there is all.
that wasn't easy, was it, Tyler?
Well, I know my dad, so I know he was just he's always trying to make a joke or something like that. But it's just a choice that you make with everyone. It's just to realize that I'm pretty stupid too. So so and I'll remain stupid if people don't patiently instruct me otherwise.
The other thing I wanted to mention is in the Messianic movement, I mean, every single one of us here, we're probably way far ahead from 99% of the people in the church. And so there's an aspect of Torah terrorism that I've heard come up. I haven't been in this thing very long, right? It's only been a couple of years for me. But because we're so far ahead, we need to be aware of and not let pride and not, we need to always maintain that the character of humility and love and be that pleasing aroma for those that are seeking, that we welcome and draw them in. Yes, we have to recognize where they're at, right? And recognize that we were there too, right? Recognize that everyone is in this process of growth. And just like what Paul said in Ephesians 4, that part of this walk that we walk is to walk in a manner that of this unity in the spirit, bearing with one another in love, recognizing where each other is and seeking to help and build up, not just beat over the head, but genuinely out of love to help them grow, right?
Amen.
That should be our desire. And so he says, let your love be genuine love, not fake love, genuine love. So how do you have genuine love? Abhor what is evil, hold fast to what's good, love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in honor. Outdo each other. That's what we should be competing. We shouldn't be competing over who has the most honor. We should be competing with how much honor we can issue each other. God is the source of genuine, sincere love, right? Through his Holy Spirit, the Ruach that has been poured out into our hearts. That's what he told us in Romans 5. And so how do we grow in this love? Well, Yeshua tells us in Luke 7, this parable. Well, it's not a parable. There was the prostitute that came to the house when he was eating with a Pharisee. And then he does go into the parable of the debtor. And he says, who is going to love more, the one who was forgiven less or the one who was forgiven much? And he says, well, the one who's forgiven much, obviously. And then so he says, yeah, that's right. He says, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. He who is forgiven loves little. And so the lesson being, those who are forgiven much loves much. Those who are forgiven little loves little. And not that, if you just think the magnitude and the extent God had to go to reconcile us, to redeem us, we should all recognize that we've been forgiven much. It's only in self-righteousness and pride that we don't see that, and we think we haven't been forgiven hardly anything, or we're so righteous that our forgiveness that we needed is so little. And so in that, he's saying you love little because you believe you've been forgiven little. But if you recognize that you've been forgiven much, that God has forgiven you much, much more than you could ever repay, then you would love much because you were forgiven much. So genuine love with brotherly affection, this is a characteristic of the Church of Philadelphia, the only church, the only one of the 7 that was kept from the hour of testing. And that word Philadelphia stands for brotherly love, and is a characteristic that we should strive to have as a genuine body of Messiah that's being built up. I'm sorry, Tyler, did you have something?
No, sorry. I'll be.
So we should outdo one another in honor. And that word in the Greek is time, I guess. And so what it means is to outdo each other in perceived value or worth, especially as a perceived honor. What has value in the eyes of the beholder, the value, weight, honor, willingly assigned to something. So you outdo each other in the value that you assign to each other. And that's what Paul got into in 1 Corinthians when he talked about we're all different members of the body. We all have different functions. And he says those who are of lesser honor, we grant even more honor and lift them up. In Philippians 2, he says, do nothing from selfish ambition. In humility, count others more important than yourself. Let's see, we have a little bit of time. I think we read to 13, right? Is that right, Paul? We read to
Yes.
13. So,
It's-
okay, thank you. So we'll finish. We'll make this the last slide. We'll end it here. He says, don't be slothful in zeal, be fervent in the spirit. And so being slothful is being lazy or slow in what the Lord has for you to do. And so that word, let's see, spode is to be swift, to show diligence, to give one's best effort. Speedy diligence. So don't be slothful in zeal. So zeal is this best effort, this diligence. And so he's saying, don't be slow, don't be lazy in the work that the Lord has for you to do. Quickly obeying what the Lord reveals is his priority. This elevates the better over the good, the more important over the important. Don't be lukewarm, right? This was to the church of Laodicea. He spits them out because they were lukewarm. We need to be hot. That fervent in the spirit is the word zeo, to boil or to be hot. We need to be hot for the Lord, on fire for him, and not lukewarm. And then it talks about rejoicing in hope, being patient in tribulation. And so in being patient in tribulation, that's where we need to lean on faith and seek the Lord for his guidance, provision, and protection. Finally, he says, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. And there's a priority order in Scripture. In Galatians 6, he says, generally, as we have opportunity, we do good to everybody, but especially to those who are the household of faith. And so there's a priority order in who we seek to take care of, right? We take care of the household of faith as a priority. I wanted to end it there. We're halfway through chapter 12. We should next week we should be able to get through chapter 12 and 13. We should be done in probably about 3 weeks, I would say. Is there anything anyone wanted to share before I stop the recording?
But I've never seen that the strength of the connection in the beginning of the chapter 12 about presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice being tied directly to renewing your mind. And I think all those verses of how we that you described are really that was really I think it's significant to me, because I've typically seen those as separate behaviors, as separate things. But I think that you can present you can renew your mind when you present your body as a sacrifice. And that idea of presenting your body was you present the sacrifice to the priest, and the priest slays it, and therefore the atonement is made. And so that idea of just making yourself available, for your will to be done, God, and is really just like presenting ourselves, and then he's the one who mortifies our flesh. So,
Tyler, when someone's in depression, the best way to get out of depression is to go help somebody else, right? So you basically give of yourself to another person. You stop dwelling on your own situation, your own mindset. And it also teaches a lot of things, because in the building of a relationship or giving to somebody else, you learn that, hey, maybe I think my things are not so bad, or my problems are not so bad. And you can bond. So I think that's why avodah, the service, which is what we're talking about, really does change your mindset, what you think about, because your focus is not on the worldly things, it's actually focused on God's stuff.
Robert, also, I want to mention about that. We went through it and I thought I wouldn't, but now that Tyler's brought it up about the root meaning, the Hebrew meaning of living sacrifice. And you talked about it, the word used there is the one they use for actually offering an animal sacrifice on the altar. And they were preaching, my pastor was preaching a series on blamelessness. And people really, you know, when you think of blameless, you think of being perfect and all of that. And they were, but nobody mentioned anything about this. So I text you about the original word. So I text you and you told me that actually the original word was the word, same word related to an animal sacrifice. So when you're blameless, you are a living sacrifice. And that I think makes it very much clearer than talking about blameless in our English language. You know, it's just, I can't be blameless, I can't be perfect, but I present myself like an animal on the altar. And
I
that's
have a blemish. Yeah, if we realize how much of Scripture is based on the temple service, probably 99%. But we don't learn the temple service. We don't study it. We don't learn anything about what the priests do and why they have a trespass offering and why they have a sin offering.
right.
We don't know how to operate. How can you operate as a temple of God if you don't know how the temple of God worked back in Torah? You can't. How do you know how to become clean? Or what's the difference between clean and unclean? Is your life operating in a clean and unclean way? You don't know unless you understand Torah. And I think that's where the disconnect has been so long for me, is that you can't understand the New Testament unless you understand Torah. It's simply you're guessing is what you've done, or you're just taking somebody else's word for it.
Well,
And
exactly right. And today, the Torah portion was on the service of the priests. And reading through that and listening to it, you know, I thought of how much clearer a lot of language in the New Testament is when you understand the language of priesthood. So, and I've read the Bible all my life, but I just never made the link, the connection like we're doing with our studies now. I appreciate that.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate all the comments. I'm going to end the recording here.